Good evening. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center, and welcome to From Homer through 2011. I have to say that I know Sappho a little, and I know Kazantzakis, but maybe we can fill in for those like myself who are. No, I'm being facetious. Before we begin tonight's program, I have a few announcements to make. Now, a lot of times people come to Philoctetes and they think that the art we have on our walls is decorative, but it never is. It's this particular show, as all our art shows, is curated by Hallie Cohen with the help of Adam Ludwig. And this is portraiture. It's about portraiture, old masters and new. And David Pettibone, Philip Perlstein, Phyllis Herfeld, Jenny Dubnow, and Matthew Miller are some of the artists represented in this show. And really, those of you who are familiar with Philip Perlstein's work, which is represented here, realize what a tremendous effect he had on art in the mid-20th century when he revolutionarily moved away from abstraction back to figuration. And in part, this particular show is having to do with that thinking that revolutionized, counter-revolutionized, I should say, art at that time. And in one way or another, the artists in this show respond to his initiatives. On March 12th, our Big Question series continues. Now, our first in the series was What is Reality? Last week we did the limitations of physical and mental reality. And the third in this part of the series is Theories of Everything. And Gareth Williams from Columbia's Classics Department will talk about the past in terms of Lucretius' famous work, De Rerum Natura, and it will move all the way up to string theory, and Herman Verlin from Princeton will be discussing that, and others will be on that particular panel. So that concludes a overarching series. Those programs have been very well attended. Huge audiences coming to confront basic questions about what makes the world we live in. On March 13th, the next day, we have Jazz at Philoctetes, continuing with soprano saxophonist Jane Ira Bloom. And those of you who have never heard Jane Ira Bloom, I really recommend that you come and see her. She's a wonderful person. She was the NASA's poet and musician in residence at one point. And this particular program deals with the Eastern influence in jazz. And so Samir Chatterjee will be here along with Jin Hai Kim on Kumongo, which I don't know what that is, and Min Zhao Fen on Pippa, which I do know what it is. March 19th, you'll see on our calendar, is Linguistics, Modern Linguistics, Language, Thought, and Action. Right now, that panel may be changed to May, but we will let you know further about that. Now, on April 2nd, Roger Copeland from Oberlin, who's been here many times, is doing Tennessee Williams, the 100th anniversary of Tennessee Williams' birth, and it's a fantastic program with Lee Brewer from Mabu Mines and a whole bunch of other people. Maud Mitchell, Basil Twist will be here, Enoch Bratter from Michigan, who's at NYU this semester. And so it's a fantastic program about Tennessee Williams, looking at him in a different light than in the one in which he's usually conceived. That is, that he, more in terms of his surrealism rather than his realism. On April 26th, poetry continues to Philoctetes with Wallace Stevens, Words That Matter, featuring Susan Howe and Joan Richardson discussing that great poet. May 14th is Poetry Scholars and Poetry Critics with Stephen Burt from Harvard, Heather Dubnow from Fordham, Eric McHenry. Rachel Haddis will be here again for that one, I believe. You coming? You coming? You really coming back? Okay. And Bonnie Costello. Now, Philoctetes is also, in conjunction with the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, been running a film program, and we have so far showed The Red Shoes, which had Joe Nakachella speaking on that movie, the dance critic of The New Yorker. And then Letter from an Unknown Woman was shown last week, and we had Tom McCarthy, the author of Remainder and C, here for that. The third in that series of films is Synecdoche, which, if you haven't seen it, please come to see that. It's a magnificent film, Charlie Kaufman film, and I think the date of that is March 27th, but consult our calendar. In fact, all of our programs, if you go to philoctetes.org, you'll be able to see this program in 3 days. They're on YouTube also. They're simulcast. If you can't get here, you can see it. And our calendar is also on philoctetes.org, so you can see all about our programs. Lastly, you may have noticed on the way in, we are asking for your support more deliberately than we have in the past because we need it. and we appreciate it. I'm now pleased to present Rachel Haddis. Rachel Haddis is Board of Governors Professor of English at the Newark campus of Rutgers University. She is the author of numerous books of poetry, essays, and translations. The Ache of Appetite is her newest volume of poetry, and Strange Relation, a memoir of marriage, dementia, and poetry is her latest prose work. And Rachel will moderate this evening's panel and introduce our other distinguished
but I can
guests.
Stay seated, right?
You certainly can stay seated. You can stay anywhere you like. Okay, and I'll remove this from your immediate vicinity.
Well, thank you so much. And I don't have to introduce myself, which is very nice. So thank you for coming. And I will introduce the other members of the panel. There's been a slight change because Edmund Keeley could not come from Princeton because he's not in tremendously good health and his wife is not well. So he's very sorry. But we have a wonderful last-minute substitute. So in alphabetical order, Peter Constantine, and this is all on your handout, but I'll read it, is a translator whose recent translations include Sophocles' 3 Theban plays, The Essential Writings of Machiavelli, Self-Deception by Bernhard Schlink, and The Bird is a Raven by Benjamin Liebert, which was awarded the 2007 Helen and Kurt Wolff Translation Prize. Peter was awarded the PEN Translation Prize for 6 early stories by Thomas Mann and the National Translation Award for the Undiscovered Chekhov, 38 new stories. He is a fellow in the program of Hellenic Studies at Columbia, and as you can tell, Peter is exceedingly multilingual, humblingly so, in more languages than you've even heard about. Karen Emmerich, who is right here next to Peter, is a translator of modern Greek poetry and prose, and she's well represented in the anthology, I'm sure you'll hear. Her recent translations include The Sleepwalker and Rien ne va plus by Margarita Karapanou, Landscape with Dog and Other Stories by Ersi Sotiropoulos, and I'd Like by Amanda Michalopoulou. Her translation of poems 1945 to 71 by Miltos Sartouris was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award, which was a nice and an unusual thing for a book of translations to get that kind of attention. Emmerich has received translation grants and awards from the NEA, PEN, and the Modern Greek Studies Association. She has a PhD in comparative literature from Columbia University and is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton. So she was able to have lunch with Mr. Keeley today and has some instructions from him. And Karen Van Dyke, who just flew in from Greece yesterday but is amazingly cogent, is Kimon Doukas Professor of Modern Greek Literature in the Classics Department at Columbia University, where she directs the interdepartmental program in Hellenic Studies and teaches courses on modern Greek and Greek diaspora literature. She received a Lannan Translation Award for the Scattered Papers of Penelope, new and selected poems by Katerina Angelaki-Rook, and also published a critical study, Cassandra and the Censors. I know that Karen's translations of Angelaki-Rook is one of the books on sale outside. So I think we've exchanged so many emails and ideas about how the evening will proceed that it would be boring to go over it all again, because I doubt if it will go according to plan. But I thought I would quote a few things that Robert Haas said in his brief and lovely introduction to the anthology, and quote some language that I or all of us came up with, which is on the website, on your program, and use that to sort of start the ball rolling in terms of questions. As we answer questions and ask one another questions, we will naturally be led to read poems and refer to poems, but this is not a poetry reading as such. And then I think we'll open it up to the audience, many of whom, again, know much more about translation than I do. It's a humbling crowd. So, two of the things that Robert Haas says in his translation that I will in his introduction, that I will refer to briefly. He talks about the silence of those 2,000 years between Callimachus and Cavafy. You know, I thought I knew Greek literature. I knew Homer, I knew Sappho. Maybe I know Cavafy or Sepphoris or Ritsos. But what about that big silence in between? That's one of the things that this book fills, and I think that we'll partly be talking about that. And along these lines, he says, after the classical era, the story was not over. It was, in fact, in the early stages of another dynamic development. That's one way he's talking about that 2,000-year silent gap. And then the language from the website refers to salient thematic and stylistic continuities characteristic of the Greek poetic tradition from the beginning, from Homer right up to now, to 2000 or 2011. And I thought I would begin by both talking myself really briefly about what some of those continuities might be, and then asking my colleagues on the panel to address that question wherever it might go. There are many ways of answering that question. There are also ways of challenging it and saying, these continuities have been exaggerated. They may not even exist. I'm open to all of this. But certainly mythology and the central topic of the Trojan War is a thread that goes not constantly, but pretty consistently right through. So I thought I would start by reading a really brief passage from the late Robert Fagles' translation of the Odyssey. This is on page 35. A friend of mine wanted page references. Odysseus weeps, hearing a minstrel sing the song of Troy. So it was not new then. Odysseus is, in a way, attending a poetry reading and is moved by what he hears. It's from Book 8 of the Odyssey. The minstrel stirred, murmuring to the god, and soon clear words and notes came one by one, a vision of the Achaeans in their graceful ships drawing away from shore, the torches flung and shelters flaring, Argive soldiers crouched in the close dark around Odysseus, and the horse, tall on the assembly ground of Troy. The horse. Everybody already knew which horse it was, as indeed my freshmen at Rutgers know all about the Trojan horse without ever having read any Greek poetry at all. It's part of our inheritance. And I'm skipping a little bit. The splendid minstrel sang it, and Odysseus let the bright molten tears run down his cheeks, weeping the way a wife mourns for her lord on the lost field where he has gone down fighting, the day of wrath that came upon his children. Homer is so wonderful at showing that both these stories are moving, no matter how many times you've heard them before, especially if they have something to do with your own story, and they're moving because you internalize them and think about your own troubles. In the Iliad, the women weep at the death of Patroclus or the death of Hector, but Homer says each of them had her own troubles in mind too. One of the great joys of our 4 or 5 years' work on this was rediscovering Greek poetry, and what is a classic if something that doesn't get used up? So having started, I could go right on for an hour, but that would be very antisocial, reading bits from Stesichorus through Euripides, through Tryphiodorus, right through Jenny Mastaraki, born in 1949, that refer to the Trojan horse or the story of Troy. And that's only one thread of continuity. But I would like to ask my colleagues in any order how they might define such a continuity.
Well, of course, I was immediately taken by the Trojan horse reference and thought we could jump to the very end.
Yeah, jump to the end. Jump to the end.
Just to pick up from that moment, and then we can go back and fill in these gaps. But it is a very funny.
Give a page reference.
Okay, this is at the very end, 663, and it's a little bit of a response to Rachel's question about continuity. Because one of the things I always find that's kind of wonderful about especially the contemporary women poets that started writing during the dictatorship in Greece, is that they refer to myth, but they empty it of all of its sort of ancient values, and they kind of really let go of a lot of the way we think of the classical world. And so you can see this in Mastaraki's poem. She says, "Then the Trojan horse said, 'No, I refuse to see the press.' And they said, 'Why?' And he said, 'He knew nothing about the massacre. After all, he always ate lightly in the evening, and in his younger days, he had worked a stint as a wooden pony on a merry-go-round.'" I mean, there's more of those
So
poems.
the subject of this mythological inheritance I love that, emptied out. Or sometimes it's a burden. What's the Ritsos poem, The Ruins of the Temple? I'll refer to the page. I don't think I'll read the whole poem. If I can find it. page 536. Yanis Ritsos, who lived for most of the 20th century. And without even finishing it, I will read you the first stanza of this short two-stanza poem. And this is translated by Edmund Keeley. Your translation was by you, right? The Mastaraki?
Right.
Okay. In the ruins of an ancient temple, the museum guard was smoking in front of the sheepfold. The sheep were grazing among the marble ruins. Further down, the women were washing in the river. You could hear the beat of the hammer in the blacksmith shop. The shepherd whistled. The sheep ran to him as though the marble ruins were running. The water's thick nape shone with coolness behind the oleanders. A woman spread her washed clothing on the shrubs and the statues. She spread her husband's underpants on Hera's shoulders. So there you have it again. But the thing is that it could almost be literal. Ritsos spent a lot of time in Samos, where there's a big temple to Hera, and there indeed would be sheep running around among the ruins. So just to talk about that kind of synchronicity, if that's the right word, becomes a big theme in Greek literature. Peter, Karen, any?
Well, one thing I wanted to say, actually, when we started working on this anthology, and the big question was, of course, is there a continuum? Can one really say that Greek literature starts with Homer and is being written this very moment, will be written 10 years from now, 100 years from now as well? And there might be two schools of thought about that, as to whether there is a continuum. In Greece, I think most people will say, oh, absolutely, there's always been writing in Greek, even before in primordial times. While the dinosaurs were there, we were already writing in Greek. and we do so now, we always have. That is on one side. Another experience I had was when we decided that we would specialize, that each editor would take one part of Greek time. And so Rachel took the ancient times, we can call it that. I took the Byzantium. Actually, Edmund Keeley took the time in between Byzantium and the ancient times. You took the...
I'm in between the Byzantine and the modern.
And the modern, and then we all worked on the modern as well. Karen helped us with everything, actually, so we did, it was
she
a
told
working
us
together.
what all the poets, who they were. She wrote all the biographies.
Right. In Athens, in Elefthouridakis, which is our Barnes and Nobles in Athens, an enormous 6th-floor building. I went and then said, could you point me to the Byzantine section, please? Byzantine poetry section. And the specialist said, δεν υπάρχει. There isn't any. I said, well, Byzantine poetry. Δεν υπάρχει. Doesn't exist. This was the poetry specialist. And in fact, there was very, very little. So we in a sense, had to find that continuity, which I very strongly believe, after having worked on this for 5 years, does exist. So there is really a time, always a time when Greek was written in Byzantine times. Particularly, Homer was very important. Things that Homer forgot to write about, maybe was then written about, like Penthesilea, the wonderful Amazon queen, epics sort of dedicated to her. Moments that weren't really treated in what's come down to us from Homer. And other things as well, of course. I mean, erotic poetry, epigrams.
Some Christian poetry.
Very Christian poetry as well. For me, that was actually the greatest find, how wealthy Byzantium is. And I think we could probably do an enormous Byzantine anthology and be quite...
And tell those people in Elefthouridakis that
there is
υπάρχει,
Byzantine poetry. Υπάρχει. Yeah.
So I wonder, can I just play the devil's advocate?
Oh, yeah,
and
do.
Sort of
Yeah.
come in
Please.
on the other side of things. I'm reading a lot these days about Solomos, Dionysius Solomos, who is the sort of considered the national poet of Greece, who wrote primarily in Italian and then translated his stuff into Greek and back and forth, and never set foot in the Greek state, which existed for about 20 years before he died. And around that period when the Greek state is getting formed in the 1820s, 1830s, there's also a sort of push to reimagine what Greek will be speaking in the streets, and then also what Greek literature is, what the Greek language is, and what the Greek literature is, and if there is a continuity of language as well. So it seems like one of the things that's to a certain extent that continuity is constructed for all kinds of reasons that are social reasons and economic reasons and political reasons, and sort of Greece trying to fit itself into the greater European sphere. And if I could read a little bit, maybe not the whole thing, of a poem by Sartoris in my translation called "He is Not Oedipus," and it's in the anthology, but it's telling, I think, that it's one of only 2 poems in Sartoris' entire body of work, which he wrote, for 50, 55 years, that actually refers to an ancient Greek anything. He doesn't.
Could you give his dates
do that.
as well?
His dates are 1919 to 2005.
And the page, Karen?
And the page is 575. It's hard to not read an entire poem. Can I just read the whole thing? I'll just read the whole thing. He is not Oedipus. A wide sky full of swallows, vast halls, Doric columns, the hungry phantoms sitting in chairs in the corners, crying, the terraces piled with dead birds, Aegisthus the net, Kostas the suffering fisherman, a room full of colored tulle fluttering in the wind. Bitter oranges break the panes of the windows and come in. Kostas, killed. Orestes, killed. Alexis, killed. Break the chains on the windows and come in. Kostas, Orestes, Alexis. Others roam the streets after the feast, with lights, with flags, with trees, calling for Maria to come down, calling for Maria to come down from the sky. Achilles' horses fly into the sky. Bullets accompany their flight. The sun tumbles from hill to hill, and the moon is a green lamp full of alcohol. Then silence falls like night in the streets, and the blind man comes out with his cane. Children follow on tiptoe. He is not Oedipus. He is Elias from the vegetable market. He plays an exhausting, deadly pipe. He is dead Elias from the vegetable market. So that's his ancient Greece, which is just being effaced, and mixed up with all of these other things. And Maria, which makes you think of the Virgin Mary, and, so all of the sort of time periods, and that's the one poem, So I think actually in the post-war he's part of the post-war generation. Something very different is happening with the way that people think about continuity and the possibilities that continuity offers, and the way that you might actually do something that's quite different than sort of rethink Greekness. I don't know.
And over against that, Elytis, who won the Nobel Prize, I forget what year, but he has a very famous passage on page 557, and I think, is this Keeley's translation also? Yes, Keeley and Savidis, where he says, "Greek, the language they gave me, poor the house on Homer's shores, my only care my language on Homer's shores." So you could almost say there's this kind of argument in Greek poetry. Mm-hmm. My language is Greek, he is not Oedipus.
Yeah.
Sort of fighting it out.
Yeah, and there's always been a Homer and Homeric Greek, I think throughout the millennia, has been held up as the ideal. And we suffered terribly, I think, in 1821 when the questions came in as to whether we should clean up the language, and the purist movement came in. Greek had turned into Creole of Turkic, and all the grammar had gone. It was a patois in a sense, almost, I think. And the Academy tried to backtrack and return to Homeric moments. Some poets back then wanted to bring in ancient Greek as a spoken language. Ultimately, there was a compromise and a purist version thereof, which was almost modern Greek but not quite, caused this sort of two language situation, which there was rioting in the streets. There were all kinds of problems until the early 70s, when it was finally abolished. And so my generation in Greece was the last generation that actually had to learn one language in school and speak another language at home. And we see that also in the Arab world, that it is a very big problem for the population if you don't have full schooling in a language you don't speak. Then you are very disadvantaged. It's hard for you to understand the news. It's hard for you to fill out a form. I remember people in the 60s doing X's because you couldn't write what you spoke. It had to be katharevusa.
But I think this is maybe one of the things that is so interesting to people outside of who don't know about is the fact that the language is, people are so obsessed with it. And Karen was mentioning the fact that the national poet first, Solomos was actually speaking Italian, writing Italian, and then translating into Greek, and this idea that the Greek language, that a poet would feel so much that he had to serve his country that he would actually not write his own language that he'd grown up in, but he'd come and make up this new language, the Greek language. And I think that what we got to when we were thinking about this question of continuity, even those of us who are sort of less convinced that there is any kind of continuity thematically or, that there is an amazing closeness of the ancient and the modern language with all these incredible other loan words from Turkish and Italian and all these other things, but there is something that you can actually sort of pick up a text and today and see words and sort of hold on to them. And I thought it might be maybe fun to even, you had mentioned Solomos, and actually read a little bit in Greek and then in English to kind of see how that works. Because one of the things that when you're doing an anthology is that the language has to be let go of at some level, and yet in a sense that's the only real thing that keeps the continuity going. And so one of the things that some of the translators that we asked to do work, and certainly those of us who were translating tried to do, is to think, well, what can you do that will actually make the American language Greek, or what can you bring over, what can you do? And this particular translation that I did with Eleni Sikilianos who's a very interesting poet who works a lot with sound, was one of the times for me where I thought, well, maybe you can kind of take it over. So I was going to read a little bit of the Greek and then read the English that we did, and maybe you'll hear it, maybe you'll not, maybe you can argue with us. But
then we should do some Eratocrates, and we should do the Prince from Western Libya.
Or maybe we should. Do you want to do that one first, since that's the meter one?
No, you've just been talking about Solomos.
Okay, but that's another wonderful example.
We'll try to give some examples of the things we're saying.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Page ref.
Okay, so this is on page 409. This is, and then maybe Rachel, you can read one of the Solomos that's a little bit more traditional. This is a very, he's a national poet. He's writing these poems that are completely strange. These are prose poems. Most of his work was all in fragments. So I don't know how everybody makes him into the national poet. But anyway, this is a very sort of creepy story about a woman. It's called The Woman of Zakynthos. And I'm just going to read you, I'll start, it's about 9 little stanzas. And I'll read it to you, and then in the middle, when there's this kind of part that's very, very acoustical, I'll read a few of the stanzas in Greek and then in English. Okay. I won't give you a single crumb. But I looked closely at her sleeping and saw clearly that it would last only a little while before it became the other kind without dreams. And because there was no one else inside, no friend, none of her own people, no doctor, no priest, I, Dionysius, the holy monk, bent down and bid her to take confession for her own good. Opening her mouth halfway and revealing her teeth, she continued to sleep. And then it was the first voice, the one I didn't recognize, that spoke in my right ear. The mind of the wretched dwells on gallows, jails, victorious Turks and slaughtered Greeks. At this very moment she sees in her sleep the thing she wanted most, her sister a beggar. That's why you saw her smile now. And the second voice that I recognized said the same words with a stammer, piling on oaths as the living do. Και η δεύτερη φωνή που εγνώριζα ξαναείπα τα ίδια λόγια, τραυλίζοντας και κάνοντας ένα σωρό ορκούς, καθώς αποζώντας συνηθούσα. Αλήθεια, μαμά, την Παναγιά, ακούσε εδώ. Αλήθεια, Αία Νικόλα, ακούσε εδώ. Αλήθεια, ακούσε εδώ. Μα τον Σπυρίδων, αλήθεια. Μα τον άχνο κράχναν τα μυστήρια του Θεού. Και εδού πάλι το μουρμουριτό που εφανότουνα η φύση ματιά μες στο καλαμιώνα. Truly in the name of Mary, holy, listen here. Truly in the name of Saint Nicholas, listen here. Truly in the name of Saint Spiridon. Truly in the name of the immaculate conception of God, the Father. And again a whisper like the wind blowing through a reed. Suddenly the woman raised her hands from under the sheet, clapped, and the flies rose up. And from inside their buzzing din, I heard the woman's voice yell, "Out, whore, get out. I won't give you a single crumb."
Did he write that in Italian and translate that into Greek?
Yeah, so it's a very, that's a very complicated question.
I see.
But all of the fragment, nobody really knows, right? All of his stuff exists in manuscripts that tend to have Greek that's sometimes written in his hand, sometimes written in someone else's hand, because he had all these people helping him, and then Italian notes in the margins as well. So a lot of the stuff, these are all unfinished, nothing he didn't publish. He published like 4 poems in his lifetime.
Am I correct that Solomos was the illegitimate child of an Italian aristocrat and a Greek lady?
Well,
That's the story I heard.
So his father was an Italian count, and his mother was an Italian serving woman who worked in the count's house.
Italian or Greek?
Greek. But who's Italian and who's Greek is sort of complicated.
Right,
anyhow,
right.
on Zakynthos at that time.
Yeah.
But they were married right before his death. So he's not illegitimate exactly, and he was the heir of
Zakynthos being an Ionian island not that far from Ithaca, speaking of Odysseus. It gets mentioned in Homer, which is, I would say, geography is another continuity, if only geographical names. Remember that if we were to take poems in English from the year, 800 BCE, there wouldn't be any. There wasn't anything that would be recognizable as English. That's an obvious point, but it can stand being made over and over, I think.
Yeah, what we should probably say as well is that that whole area of Ithaca and Zakynthos, particularly the Ionian area, was an area that was not under Ottoman occupation. So whereas the Greek mainland and all the areas of Greece, also Asia Minor, which some might say is traditionally Greek, from a historical standpoint, that area wasn't, and we had in Greece a renaissance to some extent. Wouldn't you agree? In that area, whereas in Ottoman areas everything was Turkish at the time, even though people were writing in Greek, but there just wasn't there wasn't any. Everything looked toward Constantinople, toward Istanbul. From the Greek mainland, whereas in these Italian areas, everything looked toward Rome and toward Europe, and there was some development, there was some coasting on that wave of creativity that was happening.
If you look at the map in the anthology, which unfortunately doesn't have a page, but it's right before the classical antiquities section, there's a small inset map which really does show you the large diaspora, including what is Asia Minor, Russia, the Black Sea, Libya, Egypt. The news has been very full of Greek places, or places that remind me of Cavafy. I was supposed to be talking about my latest book on NPR, and they said to me, "We're very sorry, but the news from Egypt has bumped you." And I thought, this is right out of a Cavafy poem, especially because it's Egypt.
The Prince from Western Libya.
Mm-hmm.
What?
How about reading The Prince from Western Libya?
I think, there are 2 Cavafy poems about the diaspora, and Cavafy himself from Alexandria, which has also been in the news a lot, born in Constantinople, had most of his life in Alexandria. And one of the many reasons Cavafy is so perennially relevant is that he is a poet of shifting boundaries. and culture and geography not exactly coinciding. So I think, since we're jumping around shamelessly, we should read a couple of Cavafy poems and then zip back to Eratosthenes. Could we do that? Mm-hmm. Who wants to read the Western Libya?
Should I try and read
You
it?
do it. This is page 453.
This actually, I was just telling Peter that in the car with Edmund Keeley the other day, last week he was extemporaneously reciting this poem because of everything that had been happening in Libya, that he was so distraught by the news that he had been watching all day, so he just sort of broke into Cavafy in the car, which was really, really wonderful.
It's sort of waiting for the barbarians. There's a lot of Cavafy poems that are extraordinarily relevant.
Yeah, one interesting thing about this this poem, I think, as well, it shows a time when the Greek Empire, after Alexander the Great, had brought in many people of different nationalities into a Greek-speaking world. So there were many Greeks, or people who one might think was Greek, people trying to speak Greek, speaking Greek, people trying to write Greek, not managing, trying to write like Homer, not quite managing, or maybe today we sometimes look back, which I think is also a reason why Byzantine Greek is sometimes looked down upon as faulty ancient Greek to some extent. This poem here, which the Cavafy poem translated by Edmund Keeley and Philip Sherrard, I think that does actually show a little bit of that. So, the prince from western Libya. Aristomenes, son of Menelaus, the prince from western Libya, was generally liked in Alexandria during the 10 days he spent there, as his name, his dress, modest, was also Greek. He received honors gladly, but he did not solicit them. He was unassuming. He bought Greek books, especially history and philosophy. Above all, he was a man of few words. It got around that he must be a profound thinker, and men like that naturally don't speak very much. He was neither a profound thinker nor anything else, just a piddling, laughable man. He assumed a Greek name, dressed like the Greeks, learned to behave more or less like a Greek. And all the time he was terrified he would spoil his reasonably good image by coming out with barbaric howlers in Greek. And the Alexandrians, in their usual way, would make fun of him, vile people that they are. This was why he limited himself to a few words, terribly careful of his syntax and pronunciation. And he was driven almost out of his mind, having so much talk bottled up inside him. So,
I would like to read another Cavafy poem which is more historically precise, but I need help from someone in the audience like Joan. What was the year that the Romans sacked Corinth?
27 BC.
Thank you. There you go. I knew you would know. This is a very distinguished art historian. Okay, this is page 451. And the translation is by the late James Merrill, who lived in Greece for quite a long time in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and knew Greek very well, though he was very modest about his attainments. And his translations of Cavafy are extremely witty and elegant. So you can see that the lines are kind of broken in the middle. I'm not quite sure why Cavafy did that. Was he imitating some kind of epigraphy? Or does anybody know?
Well, a lot of those poems that are actually erased in the middle are because there's time erasing the gravestone.
Yeah, okay. So, Dr. Mertens has told us that...
64.
64? Okay. But anyway, this is about the different kind of diaspora, not a Libyan who's pretending to Greek culture, but a Greek Italian, a colonist, or his parents would, or his ancestors would have come from Greece to Italy, on an Italian shore. The son of Menedorus, Chemos, a Greek Italian, fritters his life away in the pursuit of pleasure, according to the common practice in Magna Graecia among the rich, unruly young men of today. Today, however, wholly counter to his nature, he's lost in thought, dejected. There on the shore he sees with bitter melancholy ship upon ship that slowly disgorges crates of booty from the Peloponnese. Greek booty, spoils of Corinth. today, don't be surprised if it's unsuitable, indeed impossible, for the italicized young man to dream of giving himself to pleasure fully. It's a wonderful poem. Here's this rich, idle young man taking his passeggiata, and Cavafy calls it italiotis, Italianizing, and Merrill very wittily translates it italicized.
Because the typography, if you can't see it, but there's actually a wonderful amount of italics in the poem that you can't do.
Right. So Cavafy's dates are 1863 to 1933. That makes him a contemporary of poets like Yeats, for example, almost exactly. But it's uncanny the way he's come around. And in fact, he's been very popular for the last 30 years or so or more. But now the number of translations of Cavafy is completely out of control. It's sort of a diaspora unto itself. And just a word about translation. I was responsible more or less for choosing the translations of Homer through Theocritus. But all of those wonderful poems had been translated many times and were widely available, unlike the Byzantine poems. So my job was to try to choose some exciting new translations and then some wonderful translations like Fagels's that weren't so new. I decided not to use translations from the 19th century and so forth, though there are many wonderful ones there too. But Peter's challenge, for example, was different because a lot of those poems had not been translated. Or never translated, or just...
I think in many cases things had not been translated, or they might have existed in some things existed in cribs, where you would have the Byzantine Greek with simply a prose translation. In some cases, only and there's still, for instance, very many Prodromos poems that have not been transcribed or published. So I think that there is I was going to say final frontier in Greek, but maybe that's the wrong thing to say. But there is a treasure trove still to be found.
But maybe we should mention that what we did when we were translating and when we were collecting these different areas is that, on the one hand, Rachel was the one who really went through and found these translations and brought all this, and then we would all sit around a table and sort of go yes, no, and then the same thing happened for the Byzantine and the early modern sections that Peter and I were responsible for, where at some level we didn't have lots of things to choose from.
We had to either translate ourselves or these poems, or ask people to...
People were commissioned a little bit.
Well, and that maybe was one of the differences, because Peter's a really extraordinary translator who can kind of... do it. Well, I went out and translated all of Byzantine poetry, in a matter of a year or two. And in my section, which was even sort of more impoverished in terms of we just didn't have anything except for some sort of terrible Victorian translations of folk songs, with everything went da 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 da.
And that was a period of Ottoman, of the after Byzantium till 1921.
Right, and so what we did...
Ottoman occupation, so yeah.
But then that turned into another excuse of how to do translations, where I felt like there were some wonderful poets out there who could be matched up with certain poets, like getting Paul Muldoon to do Palamas or Olga Brumas to do Kiki Dimula. And that was my fun, was kind of finding people who could kind of come together. And again, we would then put them all around the table and people would go, well, it's wonderfully experimental, but no, it just doesn't work.
It doesn't always work. Obviously Greek has changed from Homer to the present, and it's easy to exaggerate the continuities, although they are extraordinary. But one interesting thing is meter, and I wanted to talk, Karen can talk a little bit about Kornaros and the Eratokritos, and I could talk about my translation of the Shark, because the 15-syllable meter, which is called the politica,
decapadosyllable,
right, and is something that really sounds pretty alien in English. It sounds overly long and overly jingly, and you could not imagine a whole epic poem in it. And yet the Eratokritos, which is in the process of being translated by Alicia Stallings, a wonderful poet and translator, maintains both that meter and rhyme. So maybe you could read a little in Greek if you want.
I didn't bring the Greek with me, but which part were you, what part were you going to read?
I was thinking just of page 368, the proem, but anything you want.
Or maybe the birth of Arethusa. That's kind of wonderful.
Sure.
But again, this is we had such fortune by having A. Stallings do this, because she really was able to work out a way of doing a meter and rhyming we'd had quite a lot of translations of Carneros, but they were so goofy. I mean, it's so hard to do that kind of.
Talk a little bit about where Carneros was from and when.
Okay, so this is the Cretan Renaissance in sort of 16.
Mid 1500s to early.
Right,
yeah.
and he's. This is a wonderful moment where a lot of the Italian forms are being reused in Greece, and this is a poem that is basically thought of as sort of the beginning of modern Greek poetry, with a love story about Eratocrates and Arethusa, and then becomes very important for Sepphoris and all sorts of other poets afterwards. And this is the story is of love and its difficulties. And this was this little part on page 369 is when they've had a lot of trouble giving birth to a child, and this is the birth of Arethusa, who's going to be the heroine. And as the years went circling by, the queen in time conceived, and all the king's anxiety and worry were relieved. Slowly, slowly came the hour that brought the heir to birth, the moment that the city waited for with joy and mirth. It was a daughter who the queen brought forth, and from the minute the midwife held her, the palace glowed, and everybody in it, the king, his queen, and all the rest were flooded with relief, and all were full of happiness and joy beyond belief. Throughout the kingdom, every house and street seemed to give voice to merriment, and every town and village to rejoice. The fresh and tender slip began to sprout up and grow strong, and she was full of beauty, charm, and wisdom before long. And when she came of age and all her virtues were unfurled, folks said she'd been born to be a marvel to the world. The girl was called the sweet name Arethusa, and her face contained in it all beauty. She was rich in every grace. Such were the gifts that nature had endowed her with, so blessed. She was, you could not find her equal in the east or west. For she was crowned with every grace and virtue. She was kind and prudent, with a noble bearing and a noble mind. And as is fitting for the daughter of such royal breeding, day and night her greatest passion was for books and reading. And it goes on.
And I'm going to read just a short passage because I think Karen Emmerich needs more airtime here, and then we're going to open it up soon. But Solomos, and now I don't know if he wrote it in Italian or Greek, because you have me completely
both at the same time.
He wrote a very peculiar poem called The Shark. This is on page 410, and a British soldier was unfortunately eaten by a shark while skinny dipping one moonlit night. This was newsworthy then, as it would be now, and he wrote, he did not rhyme like Carneros, and this would have been written, Solomos' dates are 1798 to 1857, so he was the age of, say, Keats and Shelley, except his life was longer than theirs, the same generation. But he wrote a very romantic poem. Certainly what Karen read us was not romantic. It was more like a fairy tale. He wrote a romantic poem which has been translated, the translations I've seen, translated into blank verse, sort of a narrative poem of the young man admiring the beauty of the moonlight, splashing into the water and being eaten by the shark. But to translate it into blank verse, it gives the wrong impression. It makes it sound like Wordsworth on speed or something. I mean, because you have to think of the generic connections of every kind of meter. So I tried to keep the hyper language of Solomos and a kind of a spritz of homoeroticism, but keep that same 15-syllable meter. So I'll just read a bit from the middle, where the shark jaws turns up. Then his eyes encounter it, the monster of the deep. Far out of reach his sword, alas, far out of reach his rifle. There before the young man looms the tiger of the sea. But as it splits the waters easily and now emerges just at the young man's snow-white throat that gleams as bright as swan's down, at the broad chest and golden hair, the youth that very moment, strenuously having freed himself from nature's tight embraces, which had so sweetly murmured to him, sweetly bound him up, instantly unites in his one shining naked body the sleek art of the swimmer and the surge and shock of battle. And it would have been just as easier to translate it into blank verse, but that wouldn't have been true to what I was hearing in Solomos. So other thoughts about continuity, or Karen?
I guess I'm sort of stuck in the mud with challenges to continuity, I think. Can we read a couple of poems from the post-war generation?
Oh, yeah.
Because this is a moment when people are really... So what you have is a bunch of people who are sort of historically leftist, a lot of them sort of card-carrying members of the Communist Party, who are perhaps spending years in detention camps or in internal exile, going through all kinds of horrible things and thinking about the breakdown of language, and also about, and the breakdown of society, right? So all of a sudden, faced with all of this, what kind of poetry do you write? And it might be nice to read something from... Are you interested in reading the Stopedimo? And then maybe from... Mm-hmm. I'm going to read something actually from Titus Patrikios.
Oh, good. I just turned to Patrikios, yeah.
Yeah, but which...
Or the Lionsgate.
I was thinking Words Again, but...
Yeah.
Words Again, this is translated by David Connolly. Whenever you open dictionaries, words pour out in their thousands like ants, black, red, and white, when you tread on an anthill. How do you choose from the jumble of words the single one that's required? How do you escape from the others that cling to you in droves, seeking to survive? Yet the unsaid words beneath the tongue, the solitary ones that don't emerge from the mouth, these too go on gnawing within, leaving shriveled corpses of people who tried to speak, though when it was too late. As long as I'm able to link even two words together, I exist. And it'd be great if you could read by special request
this one here?
Yes.
Manolis Anagnostakis, did we give his date? 1925 to 2005. The poem is on page 590. My child never. My child never liked fairy tales, but they told him of ogres and the faithful dog, of the journeys and of the beautiful maiden and of the big bad wolf. But the child never liked fairy tales. Now in the evenings, I sit and speak to him. I call a dog, a wolf, darkness, darkness. I point at the bad men. I teach him names like prayers. I sing to him of our dead. Enough is enough. We must tell children the truth. And actually, when we read this poem and poems of this first generation, the first post-World War II generation in Greece, and a question came up, I don't know if you remember, this was at Eleftheroudakis actually, right? Start of Viβλio, which is another incredible, actually it's an old Stoa, right, where you only buy books. But one of the questions was, when you translate something that is so specifically Greek, an experience that is so specifically Greek, in other words, a poet who has lived through World War II, the German occupation, the way it happened in Greece particularly, which was different to the way it happened in France or Scandinavia. then the terrible war, civil war that came afterwards, the famines and all of that. When poems are written in the late 40s or early 50s, when you translate them to English, what would they mean to an English reader? And I suppose that is where the question of translation, the limits of translation, and I'm sure there are many theories. But that's one thing that we spoke about quite a bit that evening when we read that in Greece. The understanding being that a Greek audience would have a very specific response to a poem like this here, My Child Never, that an American audience can't have, because you won't share the same background. I would also say a Greek probably my stepfather's generation lived through the war would react differently. I, who grew up hearing about the war in the 60s and 70s all the time, would maybe react differently. And then my younger brother, who's on the internet and texting and Facebooking and all the rest of that, has absolutely no connection. I mean, German, for instance, my mother being Austrian, when we spoke German in the 60s, we would be constantly attacked. Now, my younger brother doesn't understand that, but I mean, I still remember that. So these are all different kinds of experiences, walking down memory lane, so I don't know what...
And a younger poet, both Patricios, who was born in 1928, and Anagnostakis, born in 1925, you call them the post-war generation, but they were born in the 20s. So Dinos Siotis, who was born in 1944 and has spent a lot of time in America, has a much more, I don't want to say sentimental, but it's a much more sort of benign, elitist-like vision of Greek, right? On page 641. Tinos is my homeland, a dissyllable floating with other disyllables in the Aegean, between Mykonos and Andros, further south, Paros and Naxos. That's a more kind of user-friendly language as geography. And I do think that that's another connecting thread, even with the diaspora. Libya and Egypt, I mean, they're mentioned by Herodotus, so that these names kind of chime through the centuries of Greek poetry. And so there's a kind of a nostalgia for the language, the beauty, the islands, the island as a word, the word as an island. That's the kind of poetry that Elitis wrote. And then I remember once saying in a review that was translated into Greek, in the world of Katerina Angelaki-Rook, it's not such a beautiful Aegean world. In her world, dogs actually throw up. When she talks about mopping the floor and making the bed, and it's
right. Or maybe we could even, I don't know if you want to read one more, but maybe we could read one of hers where she's sort of rewriting the Penelope to come back to
Homer and the rewriting, and then we could open it up to the audience, because I'm sure people have questions. Sure, read the Katerina.
Well, this is where she does what Rachel's talking about, where she tells us that Penelope really wasn't waiting around for Odysseus, but that she was having trouble writing, and that she was not weaving, but she was writing and sort of erasing and writing again and writing some more. And so it's, but she also has great poems about dogs. But this is, she says, there's men, then there's women, and then there's dogs. And so she spends more time talking about women and dogs because she feels like men have been talked about a lot. So this is Penelope Says. And it's on page 617. And your absence teaches me what art could not, is the epigraph by Daniel Weisbord. I wasn't weaving, I wasn't knitting, I was writing something, erasing and being erased under the weight of the word, because perfect expression is blocked when the inside is pressured by pain. And while absence is the theme of my life, absence from life, tears and the natural suffering of the deprived body appear on the page. I erase, I tear up, I stifle the living cries. Where are you? Come, I'm waiting for you. This spring is not like other springs. And I begin again in the morning with new birds and white sheets drying in the sun. You will never be here to water the flowers, the old ceiling dripping under the weight of the rain, with my personality dissolving into yours, quietly, autumn-like. Your choice, heart, choice, because I have chosen it, will always be elsewhere, and I will cut with words the threads that bind me to the particular man I long for, until Odysseus becomes the symbol of nostalgia, sailing the seas of every mind. Each day I passionately forget you, that you may be washed of the sins of fragrance and sweetness, and finally, all clean, enter immortality. It is a hard and thankless job. My only reward is that I understand in the end what human presence is, what absence is, or how the self functions in such desolation, in so much time, how nothing can stop tomorrow. The body keeps remaking itself, rising and falling on the bed, as if axed down, sometimes sick, sometimes in love, hoping that what it loses in touch, it gains in essence.
What year was that written?
That was written in about 74, 75.
Because I was just thinking of Anne Sexton, who died in 1974. Anne Sexton's poems, which are transformations and rather bitter tweaks of fairy tales. I've just been teaching them, and my students always like them much more than Anne Sexton's more confessional poems. But they have a kind of brittleness and anger that I think this wonderful poem that Karen just read us is able in a way to deconstruct, if you like, Penelope without losing a sense of compassion and kind of reverence. It's just a beautiful poem. And it rewrites or erases without saying there was no Homer, there was no Penelope. Mm-hmm. She was born in 1939. Katerina Angelaki-Roki just had a birthday. So that's one of the nice stories about 20th century and 21st century Greek poetry, a lot of wonderful poetry by women. So we have left out a vast amount, so maybe you can help us fill some things in. We will read things by request, we'll answer questions.
You have to come up to the mic, though.
Okay. This mic here?
Yes, right there, yeah.
Good evening.
Who the hell
I
Jackie
wonder if you could
Weissmore
tell
was.
us something about the industry
I'll
of
tell you.
translation. You mentioned that there is a proliferation of translations of Cavafy, but I also noticed that in recent years there have been many translations of Rilke. So there seem to be certain poets who are translated a great deal, and I wonder why that is. They can't all find a market. I mean, it doesn't seem viable, the market for that. Is it academic pressure? Is there really a reason? I mean, I know Ray Dalvin translated Cavafy, and they seem serviceable, those translations. I'm not disputing the need for new translations, certainly always. But why is it that certain poets get translated a great deal, and what sustains this? Thank you.
Really good question. I'm going to toss it to Peter first. I have a few thoughts, but Peter is a professional translator. I'm just an academic and a poet. So, you might...
I think one thing that happens with somebody like Cavafy is that, well, I think almost any Cavafy poem you pick up is very, very compelling and will grab the imagination and the attention and everything else. And he's also very well known after Ian Forster and all that generation of British writers talked about him a lot, published him a lot. Technically, I think he is also, if one is to translate a Greek poet, he's also easier to translate in the sense that there have been other translations. So you find very many people translating Cavafy, and there really have been a spectacular amount of editions. So one doesn't really need to know Greek very well, technically speaking, because there are what one might call cribs. One can take very, very many. You could have 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 translations in front of you and then say, well, I think this probably expresses more. So I think that's one thing. If you wanted to translate Anagnostakis, it would be a little bit harder to find cribs, or if you wanted to translate Sartoris, I imagine one really would have to just take the Greek poem and try to go into the labyrinth of what is happening there. So there is, I think that's probably two reasons. There probably are more as well. What do you think?
Well, also, I mean, one big reason is that sort of a market reason, and other people here could speak to this much better. But if, say, the Sectores translation that I did, getting people to read something, it's one thing to translate something, but then sort of generating interest in a name that people don't know, it's much easier for a publisher to say, hey, let's do the 15th complete, poems of Cavafy than, let's translate Anagnostakis, who exists in one book-length edition that is out of print, and so you actually can't get your hands on it, right? But it's amazing, amazing stuff. But that's a really sort of risky move for a publisher to take unless people are sort of a little bit more adventurous in their reading habits as well. I also believe that it's great to have 15 full Cavafis and that every one of them gives us something that's really wonderful about the poet. And that you can have serviceable translations, but then you can also have translation as translation, right? And as sort of a work of literature, that it's really wonderful to be able to read 5 Cavafy, translations of On an Italian Shore, for instance, and see what each of those translators is doing with the material, or just doing if you can't access the material.
But having said that, it's a little bit out of hand. It is a little bit out of hand. And publishers are very risk averse. I guess they feel as if Cavafy sells and another Cavafy would sell. I would be interested in what the figures are. And the very much touted Daniel Mendelsohn translation from, I think, 2009 made a lot of claims that he was doing things that hadn't been done before. And there's a very good article on all of these Cavafis by Alicia Stallings, whose translation of Eratocrates we were reading, which was in Yale Review. I recommend it to you. Maybe I could give you the reference. Cavafy is very hard to translate badly. It's very hard to make him sound bad, whereas a poet like Kariotakis, whom I translate in here, who wrote in strict sonnet forms, is much less forgiving in the original. Either you rhyme and do justice to what he's doing, or you really are not faithful to that experience. And then, as I said, I think there are political and cultural reasons why Cavafy is so much of our moment. And I do think he's a really wonderful poet, but he's also somewhat easy. He does not go in for metaphor in a difficult way, as Auden pointed out in the late 50s in his introduction to Ray Dalvin's translation. He said, Cavafy is one of the few great poets in the world who barely uses figurative language at all. He's deceptively simple. Rilke is an interesting example, another really great poet who seems inexhaustible, though he kind of goes in and out of fashion more. I think what's really interesting is the claim each time that this is the new Rilke, this is a new, better Rilke. This translation is better than the others, and I'm really not equipped to say.
I must say, Rilke is a very dangerous poet to translate because he's if Cavafy is deceptively simple, I don't think that Rilke is deceptively simple, but I have noticed actually, with German, if you don't know the grammar very, very well, you might really miss that genitive goes with this, and then suddenly everything means something different. So if one wants to look at many different Rilke translations, one will see...
You see errors, I'm
errors
sure.
and
sure.
sort of disasters. So maybe Cavafy is not quite as dangerous.
But I think that also one of the things that, it's talking from a translator's perspective, we're all sort of like, there should be as many different translations of every poet. But I think one of the things that is true about Cavafy, and I think some of the other poets we've been talking about, is there's some poets who already have a relationship to the English language and the Anglo-Saxon tradition. For Cavafy spoke English first. And I've always had this feeling
his
that
first poetry was written in English,
and
actually.
His first bad poems were written in
And
English.
he spoke Greek with an English accent.
So I think there's a kind of hovering of the English around that makes him available to the English language. And my experience was that what Rachel was saying about Kariotakis as being difficult, and I sort of also schooled myself in a bunch of very difficult poets like Mastoraiki and these ones who have all sorts of different registers. And then I came to Angeliki Ruk. And that was another kind of Cavafy moment for me, because she also lives in English and translated all of American poetry, and the Sexton makes perfect sense because she translated Sexton. And,
there you go.
And so when you translate Angelakyuruk, it's almost like you're translating English. It's already there for you. You feel it, And I think so. That's a kind of inside reason, not so much.
The project that we worked, and I won't say who the publisher is, but we were asked by the Greek whether it should be edited and corrected, because Cavafy did make mistakes. I mean, did he? Well, but you remember that, right?
You mean
Or
what?
he
We were
wrote
asked
in
whether we should-
Alexandrian dialect, using the whole range of Greek. I mean, actually, his Greek is so difficult to translate, precisely because he's doing all of this stuff with grammar that is
Right. Well, we
very,
had to give
very,
a
very
directive
subtle.
to the Greek proofreaders not
to correct
not to correct Cavafy. That if Cavafy wants to do a feminine with a plural ending, omicroniota, then so be it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are effects in Cavafy where he's mixing levels of Catharevosa and other things that are almost impossible to get over into English. And the Mendelssohn translation said, well, Mendelssohn has done this and other people haven't. But actually, he doesn't do it all that well. And Cavafy rhymes quite a lot, and claims are often made, Cavafy never rhymes. Well, that's just not right. So it's complicated. It's very easy to translate. I have a funny story about translation. I have a little poem that I read at a conference in Delphi in 2004, and it was translated into Greek for the audience, and I used the English phrase, no news is good news. And that was translated into Greek, "Tanea δεν είναι ποτέ καλά," which means something quite different, means the news is never good. And I pointed out that this was a mistranslation, and the translator was in the audience, and he stalked out. It was very ungracious of me, but no news is good news, if you didn't have a sense of the idiom, might indeed mean none of the news we're hearing is good, but that's not what it means. So, other questions? Larry, could you speak to the marketing question? This is a scholar of translation.
Could you come up to the translation? If you want to speak, could you come up to the mic
Yeah,
and record?
maybe he doesn't want to, but I fingered him.
I have some questions. I have several questions. Let me
What's your
ask.
name, first of all?
Lawrence Venuti. I teach the English department at Temple in Philadelphia, and have been obsessed with translation for several decades now. So, the first question, I think, is about Cavafy, and I'm wondering about this ability to travel so well into English. So I'm going to make some extreme comments, and you could react to them and see. And the first thing I think is, does Cavafy somehow reflect an image of Greek culture or Greek poetic traditions that is very specific to English readers? Do they imagine Greek poetries as Cavafy because of the nature of his poetry? The poem about the Libyan was just so amazing, and it struck me. And he also had this kind of swipe at the Alexandrians and so forth, and there was a strange kind of defensiveness. And I'm wondering, it made me think, and also I've been reading a lot of Cavafy because there's a lot of Cavafy out there.
Nothing else to read.
Right. Does Cavafy in some way embody a notion of Greek literature as a minor literature? Not simply in the kind of defensiveness that comes up, but also in the homosexuality. I mean, there's a sexual minority and a linguistic and literary minority, and I'm wondering if this is some kind of image that has emerged, a stereotypical image, of course, in Anglophone cultures, such that there has been a silence. The silence that Robert Haas talks about, of course, means an absence of translation. And I'm wondering if the absence of translation is due to a kind of stereotype among Anglophones about what Greek poetry is. So I'll stop there.
I think, just to speak very specifically to I think that's, true, to some extent. I would totally agree. Yeah, no, and definitely thinking about Cavafy as a minor poet writing from outside in relation to the Greek mainland. He's in Alexandria, not in Athens. And yes, and then sort of Greece being outside of everything else in some sense on the fringes. And he's looking at these historical moments that are sort of moments either of like the Greek Empire in decline or right before, the stuff hits the fan for the Greek Empire. So for those really interstitial sort of historical moments. But there are many ways of reading Cavafy in English, I think. And I mean, as you've written or said, or both, thinking about the Cavafy that we have in Britain and the Cavafy that we have in the U.S. are actually very different Cavafys. It's sort of a breakdown along the historical Cavafy versus the erotic Cavafy. And you can say that they're all sort of wrapped up in one another anyhow. But I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that there are sort of different traditions within microcosms of the English-speaking world of dealing with Cavafy's work. I don't know.
What I'm hearing is also that at some level, what I sort of said about, you can hear that almost language-wise, Cavafy is available to the English language. You're saying not just language-wise, but just in terms of the kinds of ways that Greece is imagined.
The themes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then therefore the question you're asking is about, so what about all the silence, all the other things that don't get translated, right?
Right. The silence that Robert Huston speaks of is a neglect by translators. That there have been, millennia of Greek poetry that hasn't been translated. That's what he's really talking about. So why the neglect? It must be, I shouldn't say must be, but maybe it's that translators imagine a continuity.
Well,
Get ready.
So
And they just think that, if all Greek poetry is dealing with the same kinds of themes, why don't we just go for the greats and translate Homer?
They're risk averse, like I say. Publishers are very risk averse.
But I feel very uncomfortable with putting that in the lap of the translators. For instance, there have been recently 2 really, really great and wonderful translations of Engonopoulos, for instance, who's like a surrealist poet. That David Connolly did one and Martin McKinsey did the other. And I mean, does anybody in this room know that those translations exist? No, but we all know about David Mendelssohn's Cavafy, right? So there are translators, right? And I'm constantly trying to get editors interested in doing a Livaditis volume or an Anagnostakis so he can be in print again. And the trend is to be like, oh, but how about Ritsos, because he's a recognizable name. Don't we all have like tons of translations in our drawers, in our desk drawers, that of the people who you really, really want to get people to read, and the people you get to read them are your friends. Because you give them PDFs or whatever. So I think that there's partly, that and then readers too, it's a responsibility that's a joint responsibility. I think that's not just that of translators.
It's how do we as translators then give access to those parts of a tradition that are not as recognizable as that tradition? And I think that does take a lot of kind of the work that you're doing so wonderfully with all this prose that nobody knew anything about Greek prose, and you're getting all these translations out by Karapanu and Michalopoulou, and creating a context where we just did a global forum. a roundtable forum on Karapanu, and it was fun because talking about this Greek writer, and with a bunch of other writers, and gave her a context here and there, and that's the kind of thing that I think that is more possible now with the internet, where you can just sort of open up these discussions, or I suppose what we're doing tonight.
These are really interesting points you've raised, and I'm thinking about them, but it's also worth noting that an anthology was edited by a poet critic who's represented here, I think born in 1945, called Nassos Vayanas, called Metandropou tu Cavafy, in the manner of Cavafy, and he translated into Greek poems by poets who were more or less my contemporaries from all over the world: Argentina, Russia, Portugal, some Arab countries, and I'm not sure if these poets were trying to write like Cavafy or referencing him, but clearly they had all read Cavafy, and in some way they acknowledged his influence. So this was more a global thing. It was an interesting thing that he did. And he translated, for example, a poem of mine into modern Greek, which is always fun to see, with no mistakes. But I think it's really good to remember that if we have a 17th new translation of Cavafy, somebody else is being, if not silenced, then neglected. I mean, there are analogies with, say, music programming by orchestras. My husband was a composer of contemporary music and was very bitter about how Tchaikovsky got played every season. But it was extremely difficult to program new music. That's a kind of an analogy. Yeah. Oh, I guess microphone.
I'd just like to share an observation on Cavafy. I think his persona, the mask that he puts on, is that of a global elitist, which I think is one of the reasons why he's so accepted in many, many nations and different cultures. And the Greek government, 1920, gave him the Grand Cross of the Order of the Phoenix. And most of his poetry was distributed among the Greek diplomats. He wasn't thinking of publishers. So I imagine that poetry in the 20th century and literature in general became a form of cryptography among politics of different countries, like Ezra Pound, for example. And
so
all the expatriates in Paris, and I think it's just something to think about.
I like that. Now it's literary criticism that's cryptography. I like that.
Well, look, the World War I was started with a phrase from a poem. Into the valley of death we ride. All the actors in World War I got the same telegraph, and we're all supposed to meet at time and place.
It's really interesting.
I have a response again to what Larry was saying. Just one quick little thing about thinking also about the role that anthologies play. And I mean, obviously this anthology is from Homer to the present day, but one thing that Peter and Karen and I are now working on is an anthology of Greek poets who are writing today, who are young, who are like in their 30s, 20s, some of them. And so thinking about the role that you play, not just as a translator, but as a constructor of an anthology, right? You are sort of picking and choosing and making a story about what these people, who these people are.
Some of these poets actually, like Jazra Khalid, who's Chechnyan but who writes in Greek, was unpublishable in Greece because it was so anti-Greek in a sense, I would say. No? I mean, his motto is poetry is attack. So he wrote black words and this is very, very potent dynamite kind of poetry that has been translated into Japanese now, into Burmese, in Germany is doing very well. Serbian, I think he's still not published in Greece.
Well, he's publishing...
Except for Teflon, which is the magazine.
But he writes in Greek.
He writes in Greek.
And actually, a lot of these young writers, right, they're all bilingual, trilingual, and they're writing very multilingual group.
Yeah, Konstantinos Sampanis, for instance, who I'm also very interested in. I'll be sending you some poetry, actually, by him, is a Sanskritologist living in Austria, 31 years old. So there are new trends, and I would say Greece is for the first time becoming a sort of a global situation, or I should say becoming again, because as we saw in Byzantium when we had Syrians writing in Greek or Libyan princes trying to pass for Greek, now we have again names like Kyoko Kishida or Jazra Khalid or that's only one thing. Of course, there are very many young Greeks as well writing. I just tapped into that one particular instance. How are we doing for time, by the way?
Well, it's almost 8:30 and people are sneezing. It's cold. we could stop or we could take one more question. Yeah, Steve.
You began to talk about this, Rachel. I wonder if maybe some of you could just say some more about which of these poets you think lose the least in translation and which lose the most, and why.
I like to think about gaining in translation. Because you gain a whole new language, right? And a whole new set of references, and so...
I've always felt that Homer is easier to translate well than Greek tragedy. Partly because Homer has such a strong narrative line, and partly because some of Homer's phrases like rosy-fingered dawn are beautiful and evocative and characteristic, however it's done. We certainly prefer some Homer to others, but when I was translating Euripides' Helen about 10 or 15 years ago, not that I hold mine up as a model, but I was looking at a lot of translations of this not well-known Euripides play from the 20th century. A lot of them had sunk like a stone. I mean, they might have been done because someone was getting tenure. I have no idea. But it was hard to know why the translator translated Helen and if they ever imagined it being performed. And I came to think of translations of Greek tragedy as often written in a Martian language that no one on earth ever spoke. Whereas with Homer, you at least feel someone is telling you a story. So that's, among the famous ancient Greek poets, that's very hard. Aristophanes, people have tackled Aristophanes in different ways. In the middle of the 19th century, a man named Benjamin Bickley Rogers made him sound like Gilbert and Sullivan. And Aristophanes has a lot of fun with dialects. The Spartans have a dialect and the Dorics have a dialect. So this Rogers, who was a clergyman, if the Spartans sounded as if they came from Scotland, for example. So people, how do you do a dialect? You do another dialect. The ballads, the anonymous folk songs, as Karen said, came out sounding kind of sticky and sugary and anonymous. It's a good question. And I would want to say that a really great poet would be resistant to translation. Thinking of a poet like Gerard Manley Hopkins, I can barely imagine him being translated. And yet, Cavafy is at the other end of the scale. He's way simpler and less elaborate than Hopkins, and easier to translate. I know he's not that simple, Karen, but one can't generalize and say difficult is good, simple is bad. And then Karen is about to say Cavafy's not that simple, and he's not. So.
He's grammatically totally. I mean, what do you do with homophonic rhyme? Like two words that sound tiki, and one means walls and one means fate.
Right.
You can't do that,
Right. Exactly. No, it's a really interesting question, which means I don't have a good answer.
Thank you very much.
We have another question.
You can come in like this.
We have one more question, but people can put their comments.
I can't imagine a better place for me to speak right now than here. There is a translator of Homer who's been enormously neglected, and he does it into stress-based English dactylic hexameter. His name is Rodney Merrill. He's published by the University of Michigan. He has an Iliad, which is even better than his Odyssey.
Wow.
Think at it. Take a look at it. You might want to compare it and say, well, I don't like it as much, but on the other hand, he has some of the rhythm. Rodney Merrill.
Okay.